now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak with experts from around the world on issues making headlines. With just 1 month left until South Koreans vote for their 20th president, the front-running candidates are now clarifying their positions on the biggest domestic and foreign policy issues that the country is faced with. Today, we take a look at the major pledges made by the leading presidential hopefuls, zooming in on their foreign policies in particular. For this, we connect with Byoung-joo, professor at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, and Ramon Pacheco Pardo, head of department and professor of international relations at the Department of European and International Studies at King's College London. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us again. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Kim, joining us on the phone. The two front-running candidates, the ruling Democratic parties, Lee Jae-myung, and the main opposition People Power parties, Yoon Suk-yeol, they seem to be offering very similar pledges on the biggest domestic issues. Why do the campaign pledges look so similar this year, and where can we find key differences?
Well, that is because Korean politics is not as so much polarized as in other countries like the United States. For instance, United States, their politics is so polarized between the two different sizes. What you really have to focus on is voter mobilization. You got to make sure that people who support you will actually come to the ballots and then vote. So for that, what you have to do is you have to show kind of stark different, very different kinds of policies from your opponents. Here in Korea, on the other hand, it's different. Right now, what we see is rather than the voters divided by half, like United States, it's different here. It's as much as we say these days, over 30% of the Korean voters are still not so decided, not much decided in terms of whom they're going to vote for, and we call them centrist voters. And these voters can vote either side. And so that's exactly what you have to target, what you have to focus on. You have to win those centrist voters. And in order to win those centrist voters, you have to come up with these policy proposals that will appeal to them. And when both sides try the same, we see this kind of similar policy pledges coming out of both sides. So, for instance, like the last Thursday debate that we saw, the first presidential debate this time among the four candidates, we saw their policies. For example, the first topic that they talked about was real estate policy. Both sides, they said, they have to focus on supply expansion, growing supplies, increasing supplies in order to deal with the situation. About the job market, job creation, they were all talking about, how they should encourage young people to find creative new businesses and new kinds of jobs. They are all talking about science and technology policy, where government wants to take a more active role. They're all talking about expanding faster train services to cover the country as a whole in infrastructure debate. Welfare policy, they're all agreeing on the need for pension reform. So those, they were all agreeing on most of the major political pledges as we just went over here. The only area we noticed a difference between two major candidates was foreign policy side. So that's our observation so far.
And Professor Kim, well, of course, we have the two minor candidates as well, the minor leftist Justice parties, Shim Sang-jung, and the centrist minor oppositions, An Chol-soo of the People's Party. What kind of agendas are they trying to push forward? And also, why is the South Korean public so fixated with the two major political parties, despite being disillusioned by them both?
Yeah, setting aside two major leading candidates, An Chol-soo, the third one, I guess, who show numbers like somewhere between 10 to 15% of the polls. The one who comes from who represent People's Party, he seems to focus on science and technology policy. He has introduced a long list of government actions that will take place, to support Korea's growth in science and technology. And he sums up his policy pledge, what he called 555 pledge. He wants to make sure that at least 5 major new businesses will grow to the top world leading level coming from Korea. And he wants to help at least 5 companies here in Korea to grow to the size of Samsung Electronics. And then he wants to help Korea becoming one of the world's major top 5 economies in the world. So he called it 555, which are not that different from other leading candidates there. The fourth one, Sim Sang-jung, who represents Justice Party, she is the real progressive candidate, and she has been around for a long time and very well experienced, but the smallest among the 4 candidates in terms of the poll numbers and so on. She talks about being a progressive candidate. She talks about 4-day week, 4-workday week, which is quite radical from Korean standard, because we just had moved on to 5-day work week in a full scale quite recently, if you will. And she was talking about the annual leave of 25 days, achieving that kind of system. And she also talks about government guarantees for everybody in Korea to have their jobs that they like. That's very, very ambitious plan as well. But also she talks about the reforming of the medical insurance system, which seems to be quite centrist in a way, making it more rational. And she talks about her political side, making Parliament, National Assembly, more center of the political operation, reducing the power and scope of the presidential system, and then shifting more power to the Parliament. So those are the policy proposals coming from the third candidate An and the fourth candidate Sim Sang-jung here.
And well, Professor Pacheco Pardo, now, how do you think the 2 front-running candidates are going to position themselves when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to these very dynamic times in the Indo-Pacific region, where we're seeing a lot of tension and a lot of rivalry between the major powers?
I think if we look at their platforms, I would expect continuation of some of the policies that has introduced. So, in a way, I think it has been quite clear that he has been more willing to cooperate with the U.S., especially since President Biden took office. There has been more willing to cooperate with the Quad countries, for example, issues such as vaccines, but also with broader coalitions of democratic countries. So, for example, if we look at semiconductors, tech in general, there's this talk about Korea, along with other countries in the Indo-Pacific, along with European countries, of course, with the US as well, trying to form coalitions. And I think that there might be a slight difference in how critical the Conservative Party candidate Yoon Suk-yeol might be willing to be of China, or openly critical, I should say. But I think in terms of actual policy, I would assume that any of the 2 leading candidates, Yoon Suk-yeol or Lee Jae-myung, whoever wins the election, they will continue to distance themselves from China, as South Korea has been doing over the past couple of years. And the other aspect that I think will become more prominent, whoever wins the election, is that they will try to work in minilateral coalitions. There's a lot of talk about multilateralism, but let's face it, we have these minilateral coalitions of democratic countries coming together, trying to come with economic policies, security policies. And I think that South Korea will be part of those minilaterals regardless of who wins the election.
So it looks like there won't be a radical departure from the current trajectory of foreign policy that the current government is pursuing. But Professor Pacheco Pardo, now, I understand that you carried out a survey of the 2 top candidates on their foreign policy towards the European Union in particular. And well, there seem to be more similarities than differences in both candidates Yoon and Lee's positions on relations with Europe. But what stood out to you the most?
Yes, we asked the Jae-myung campaign and the Yoon Suk-yeol campaign about their views about cooperation with the EU, with NATO, with European countries in general, which it was the first time that the candidates were asked these questions before the election. And we see a couple of similarities. I think the first one is there's this wish to diversify relations, not to be too dependent on the alliance with the US, which of course will remain the cornerstone of South Korean foreign policy, But this idea that Korea has to cooperate with other partners across the world, which share similar values. And here you have, of course, the European Union and European countries such as France, Germany, the UK, or Spain, for example. And I would say a second similarity is this focus on economics, this focus on economic cooperation, areas such as tech that Professor Kim was talking about at the domestic level. So this idea that there can be cooperation with other countries that share values with Korea and that also very technologically advanced to develop new technologies, let's say, for example, 6G, in the area of robotics, for example, vaccines for potential pandemics in the future. So there is this similarity. There might be a slight difference in that I think the Yoon campaign made clear that when it comes to security, they would be willing to more openly cooperate on issues such as cyber and maritime security with NATO and with key European countries as well as the European Union. And the HMM campaign maybe considering whether this is something that is in the interest of Korea if they win the election or whether they want to follow a different path.
And Professor Pacheco Pardo, now how about the minor parties led by Shin Sang-jung and Choi Soo? They still seem to lack sufficient support from the public to be taken seriously compared to the two major candidates. Do you think they need a more developed foreign policy platform?
I think at the end of the day, voters in Korea, like any other country in the world, they focus more on domestic issues. Having said that, obviously there are two foreign policy issues that are domestic in the case of Korea. One of them, of course, relations with North Korea, and the other one, the U.S. alliance, and by definition, a triangular relationship between the U.S., China, and Korea itself. So I think it would make sense to express more quickly their policy towards North Korea, even though this is something that, of course, has been raised in the previous presidential debate, and it might be raised in future debates that are coming up. But also, how do they see the relationship between Korea and the U.S. and the worsening, really, relations with China, which we're seeing even this week during the Olympics taking place in Beijing. But this really goes back to the past 2-3 years, or even to the deployment of THAAD and the reaction of China. So I think it would make sense to discuss these issues, which, as I said, even though in theory they're foreign policy issues, for all intents and purposes, they have become domestic issues because they do impact South Korean policy very strongly.
And well, we're almost out of time, I'm afraid. But Professor Kim, before we go, now both front-running candidates have been rather unpopular with the Korean public. What do you think will be the decisive factor when South Koreans make their choice on March 9th?
I would say the upcoming presidential debate. In my understanding, we have 3 remaining. The second one, the first among the 3, starting, as I mentioned, 2 days from now, Friday. And because we have centrist voters, we'll be closely watching how they define their initiatives and policy pledges further more clearly. And in doing so, of course, the negative campaign tactics will backfire. We saw evidence the last time that people liked that candidates didn't try really negative campaign tactics last time in the first debate. So that's something they should keep in mind. And they all have to show sort of human touch. It's not always the best debater wins the debate. Someone who can approach the voters with good feeling on the emotional side, that matters as well. So that'll be a very important factor. And in doing so, in the same lines, kind of showing their sincere care for the people and national interest and public interest and so on. So how you reach out to the voters, to their hearts in the remaining 3 presidential debates, I think they will largely determine who's going to win in this election, which is only about, 3 weeks' time, considering the early voting starts at March 4th and 5th. So that's very short time, not much time remaining on our watch.
Just a month left to go. Well, that was Byoung-joo, professor at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul, and Ramon Pacheco Pardo at King's College London. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.